James, a kind-hearted black man from New Orleans, met Elizabeth, an elegant English lady, in the early 1930s. Their love story began in a time when the world frowned upon their union, yet they defied every obstacle. Their love was quiet but fierce, built on laughter, shared struggles, and a deep, unwavering bond. In the summer of 1935, they married in a small chapel, vowing to stand by each other against all odds. For 6 decades they lived a life filled with memories, raising children, traveling the world, and growing old together in a cozy house filled with books, photographs, and the scent of Elizabeth's favorite lavender perfume. James adored her and she him. Their love never faded, not even as age weakened their bodies. But in the winter of 1995, Elizabeth fell gravely ill. James rarely left her side, holding her hand through every labored breath. One evening, as the wind howled outside their bedroom window, Elizabeth reached for his hand, her eyes clouded with sorrow. "There's something I must tell you," she whispered, her voice trembling. James stroked her fragile fingers. "Whatever it is, my love, it won't change a thing." A single tear slid down her cheek. "I wasn't honest with you about my family." Confused, James waited as she gathered her strength. "My parents," she continued, "they never died in the war as I told you. They were alive, but they disowned me for marrying you." James felt a sharp pain in his chest, not from age but from the weight of her words. He had always believed Elizabeth's parents had passed when she was young. To know they had been alive, yet chose to erase their daughter from their lives because of him, it was a wound that cut deep. "They made me choose," she whispered. "And I chose you." James' throat tightened. He had spent 60 years believing he had no in-laws, never questioning why she never spoke of them. Yet, through all those years, Elizabeth had carried this burden alone, protecting him from a truth that would have broken his heart. Tears filled his eyes, but he swallowed the ache. He couldn't be angry, not after all they had shared. Instead, he kissed her forehead, his voice thick with emotion. "You chose love, Lizzie. And I would have chosen you every time." A weak smile graced her lips, and with one last sigh she closed her eyes, her fingers still laced with his. As the snow fell outside, James sat in silence, holding the hand of the woman who had sacrificed everything for love. And though his heart ached, he knew that no secret, no matter how painful, could ever erase the life they had built together. In the days that followed Elizabeth's passing, the house felt unbearably silent. James moved through the rooms like a ghost, each corner filled with echoes of her laughter, her soft humming, the warmth of her presence that could never be replaced. The scent of lavender still lingered in the air, as if she had only just stepped out of sight. Despite the grief weighing on him, he couldn't stop thinking about what she had told him before she took her last breath. Her parents had been alive all those years. They had chosen to cut her out of their lives simply because she loved him. James sat in his old armchair, staring at the flickering fireplace. A part of him wished he had known earlier. Would it have changed anything? Would he have been able to make peace with them? Or would it have only brought more pain to Elizabeth, knowing that he had been hurt by their rejection? One evening, while sorting through Elizabeth's belongings, James found an old wooden box tucked away in the bottom drawer of her dresser. It was locked, but the key lay hidden beneath a pile of silk scarves. With trembling hands he opened it. Inside he found letters, dozens of them, yellowed with age, addressed to Elizabeth in a careful, familiar handwriting. His heart pounded as he unfolded one of them. "Elizabeth, please reconsider. This is not the life you were meant for. Come home before it's too late." The signature at the bottom was unfamiliar, Margaret Townsend. James frowned. The name meant nothing to him, but as he sifted through the letters, he realized they were all from Elizabeth's mother. The words shifted from cold demands to desperate pleas. "You will regret this, my child. Do you not miss your family? We can still fix this, but you must leave him." The last letter, dated years after their wedding, was different. "I see now that you will never return. I only hope you are happy. I will no longer write." James clenched his jaw. Elizabeth had never responded. She had chosen him over and over again, even when her own mother reached out one final time. Tears blurred his vision. He had spent his entire life loving Elizabeth, but he had never truly understood the price she had paid to be with him. That night, James sat by the fireplace, the letters beside him. He thought of Elizabeth as she had been in her youth, radiant, strong, full of defiance against a world that sought to tear them apart. He thought of her in old age, still full of love, still looking at him the same way she had on the day they first met. He could not bring back the years they lost with her family. He could not change the choices that had been made. But he could honor the love she had given him, the sacrifices she had made. With a deep breath, he picked up the last letter and whispered, "She was happy." And as the fire crackled softly, James knew he would carry Elizabeth's love with him for the rest of his days. In the weeks that followed, James found himself drawn to the letters again and again. Each word, each sentence, felt like a window into a past Elizabeth had never shared. He wondered if she had ever hesitated, if there had been nights when she longed to write back, to mend the bond with her mother. Yet she had never wavered, not once. One afternoon as he sat by the window watching the rain fall, a thought struck him. Elizabeth's parents had disowned her, but had they truly forgotten her? Was there anyone left from her family who still carried her memory? Determined to find out, James reached for the telephone. He had never bothered tracing Elizabeth's family, believing they had been lost long ago. But now, something inside him told him he needed to know, needed to see if there was a missing piece of Elizabeth's story that she had left behind. After weeks of searching, James finally found something. An address. A small countryside estate in Sussex, England. It belonged to a Margaret Townsend, not Elizabeth's mother but her niece. With a mixture of nerves and determination, James packed a small bag and boarded a plane to England. The journey felt surreal, as if he were stepping into a past he had never been meant to witness. When he arrived at the estate, he hesitated at the gate. What if they turned him away? What if they still held the same prejudices that had torn Elizabeth from her family? But then he thought of his wife, of the love they had shared, and he took a deep breath before knocking on the door. A woman in her 50s answered, her sharp blue eyes widening in surprise when she saw him. "Can I help you?" she asked cautiously. James cleared his throat. "My name is James Carter. I was married to Elizabeth Townsend." Her breath hitched. "Aunt Elizabeth?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. James nodded, and in that moment he saw it. The same delicate features, the same spark in her eyes that Elizabeth had carried all her life. "Please," Margaret said, stepping aside. "Come in." Inside, the house was filled with old portraits, memories frozen in time. James' eyes scanned the walls, stopping on a photograph of a young Elizabeth, no older than 20, standing beside a stern-looking woman. Her mother. Margaret followed his gaze. She was beautiful, wasn't she? James swallowed the lump in his throat. She was everything. Margaret sighed, leading him to the sitting room. "I never met her. My mother used to talk about her in hushed tones, as if she were a ghost that still haunted this house. We were told she had disgraced the family, that she had chosen a life that was unacceptable. But when I grew older, I found the letters she had sent, letters my grandmother never sent back. She loved your wife, Mr. Carter. In her own way, she regretted everything." James felt his heart ache at the words. Elizabeth's mother had loved her after all, but too late, too distant, too afraid to undo the damage she had done. Margaret reached for something in a nearby drawer and handed him a small, worn-out envelope. "I think this belongs to you." James opened it carefully. Inside was a faded photograph, Elizabeth on her wedding day, smiling radiantly in her lace gown. And behind it, in the same careful handwriting from the letters, was a note. "If I could turn back time, I would have held on to you instead of letting you go. I hope you have found the happiness you deserve." James closed his eyes, clutching the letter to his chest. Elizabeth had chosen him, but perhaps in some quiet way, her mother had never truly let her go. As he left the house that evening, James looked up at the English sky, the stars twinkling like distant memories. Elizabeth was gone, but her love, her sacrifices, her story, they would never be forgotten. And for the first time in weeks, he smiled. James returned to New Orleans with a heart full of emotions, grief, closure, and a newfound connection to the woman he had loved for 6 decades. He had left for England searching for the missing pieces of Elizabeth's past, but in truth he had found something deeper, a sense of peace, knowing that even in distance and silence, love had persisted. Back home the house felt different. The air was still thick with memories of Elizabeth, but now, instead of aching loss, James felt comfort. He spent his days tending to their small garden, a place Elizabeth had always cherished. He found himself talking to her in quiet moments, telling her about Margaret, about the letters, about the photograph he now kept on his bedside table. One evening, while sorting through more of Elizabeth's belongings, James found an old leather-bound journal tucked away in a forgotten drawer. He hesitated before opening it, wondering if she had meant for him to see it. But as he flipped through the pages, he realized it was not a private diary, but a collection of thoughts, poetry, and letters she had never sent. One entry caught his eye, written in delicate handwriting. "James, my love, if you ever find this, know that there was never a moment I regretted choosing you. Not when I walked away from my family, not when the world told us we did not belong together, not even in the quiet moments when I wondered if my mother still thought of me. You were my home, my greatest adventure, my truest love. If I leave this world before you, promise me you will keep living, keep loving, keep remembering that we defied the odds. Love does not end, my dear. It simply changes form." Tears blurred James' vision as he ran his fingers over the ink, as if he could somehow reach back through time and hold her once more. He closed the journal, pressing it to his chest, whispering into the quiet room, "I promise, Lizzie." Days turned into weeks, then months. James did not let grief consume him. Instead, he carried Elizabeth with him in every sunrise he watched, every jazz song that played on the radio, every memory that surfaced like a gentle wave. He visited their favorite places, spoke about her often, and even wrote letters to her, just as she had once written to her mother. One autumn afternoon, James sat on their porch, the golden light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the garden. A letter from Margaret had arrived, filled with stories of Elizabeth's childhood and a promise to stay in touch. He smiled, realizing that in some way, Elizabeth's family had found their way back to him after all these years. As the breeze carried the scent of lavender through the air, James closed his eyes and whispered, "You were right, my love. Love does not end." And with that, he continued living, not just for himself but for the woman who had chosen him, loved him, and left behind a love so strong, it would never fade. The years passed gently, each one carrying echoes of Elizabeth's presence. James, now well into his 90s, moved a little slower but still carried himself with quiet dignity. He had kept his promise to her. He had lived, loved, and remembered. Margaret wrote to him often, sharing stories of Elizabeth's childhood that filled in the gaps he had never thought to ask about. Through her words, he learned about the girl Elizabeth had been before she became his wife, the mischievous child who had once climbed the tallest tree in their garden, the young woman who had dreamed of traveling the world before love changed her course. One day Margaret surprised him with an invitation. "James, I would love for you to visit again. There's something here that belongs to you." Curious and feeling a pull toward England once more, James made the journey across the ocean. The familiar countryside estate stood just as he had left it, a place that had once been Elizabeth's home but had never truly welcomed her back. Margaret greeted him warmly and led him to an attic filled with dust-covered trunks and forgotten heirlooms. She stopped in front of one particular chest, its brass fittings tarnished with age. "This belonged to my grandmother," she said softly. "After she passed, I went through her things and found something you should have." James knelt beside the trunk as Margaret lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped carefully in an old lace shawl, was a stack of letters bound with a faded ribbon. "She never sent them," Margaret whispered. "All those years, she wrote to Elizabeth but never found the courage to send them." James' hands trembled as he untied the ribbon. The first letter was dated the year Elizabeth had left for America. "My dearest Elizabeth, I do not know if you will ever read this, but I miss you terribly. I pretend that I do not, that my pride is stronger than a mother's love, but it is not. I wonder if you are happy. I wonder if you think of us. I wonder if you will ever forgive me." James swallowed hard and flipped through the letters, each one a reflection of a mother's unspoken regrets. It was too late for Elizabeth to read them, too late for her mother to say the words that might have mended the past. But James could carry the truth for her, even if she was no longer there to hear it. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, James sat in the garden with the letters beside him. He felt Elizabeth's presence in the wind, in the rustling leaves, in the soft golden light that painted the sky. "You were always loved, Lizzie," he murmured, even when they didn't know how to show it. As he closed his eyes, he imagined her smile, her laughter, the way she had looked at him on their wedding day. The love they had shared had defied time, distance, and even death. And as the night settled over the English countryside, James knew that when his own time came, he would not be afraid. For somewhere beyond the stars, Elizabeth was waiting. James returned to New Orleans with the letters carefully packed in his suitcase. He placed them beside Elizabeth's journal on his nightstand, feeling as though a missing piece of her story had finally been returned to her. Though she was gone, he spoke to her often, reading the letters aloud as if she were sitting beside him, listening. As the years passed, James became a storyteller. He shared tales of Elizabeth with their grandchildren, painting vivid pictures of the woman who had defied the world for love. He told them of their adventures, their struggles, and the life they had built together. One afternoon as he sat on their porch rocking gently in his chair, his great-granddaughter Lily climbed onto his lap. She was only 5, with Elizabeth's bright blue eyes and his warm brown skin. "Tell me about Grandma Lizzie again," she asked, playing with the buttons on his cardigan. James chuckled softly. "Which story do you want to hear, my little star?" "The one where she ran away from home for you," Lily said, her tiny fingers tracing the lines on his weathered hands. James smiled, stroking her curly hair. "She didn't run away, darling. She walked away knowing she was walking toward something greater." Lily tilted her head. "Like a fairy tale?" James thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Yes, just like a fairy tale. But the best kind, the kind where love wins." Lily giggled, resting her head against his chest. "I like that story." James gazed at the sky, where the sun was beginning to set, painting the clouds in soft shades of pink and gold. He felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that Elizabeth's story would live on, passed down through generations. That night, he placed a single letter from Elizabeth's mother into her journal and whispered, "I found the words she never got to say, my love. I hope you can hear them now." As he lay down to sleep, the scent of lavender drifted through the room. James smiled, feeling the warmth of an unseen presence beside him. And in the quiet of the night, with the moonlight casting gentle shadows across the walls, James closed his eyes for the last time, knowing that his love story was finally complete. Somewhere beyond the stars, Elizabeth was waiting. And this time, there was nothing left to keep them apart. The morning sun rose softly over New Orleans, casting golden hues across the garden that James and Elizabeth had tended together for decades. But inside the house, everything was still. The rocking chair on the porch sat empty, swaying gently in the breeze. The scent of lavender lingered in the air, as if time itself had paused to honor a love that had spanned lifetimes. When Lily's mother came to wake James, she found him lying peacefully in bed, a faint smile on his lips. The journal was beside him, Elizabeth's letters resting atop it, his fingers gently curled around one of them. He had passed in his sleep, as if he had simply drifted into a dream where Elizabeth was waiting. The family grieved, but there was no sorrow in the way James had left this world. Instead, there was an unshakable sense of peace, as if his journey had finally come full circle. At his funeral, they didn't speak of loss but of love. Of the man who had defied the odds for the woman he cherished. Of a love so strong, it had outlived time itself. Margaret flew in from England, bringing with her the letters James had left behind, the ones he had written to Elizabeth after her passing. Lily, now a little older, stood beside her great-grandfather's grave, holding one of his letters in her tiny hands. She couldn't read all the words yet, but she knew what they meant. Before leaving, she placed the letter on the headstone, whispering, "Grandpa James, tell Grandma Lizzie I love her." The wind picked up, rustling the trees, carrying the scent of lavender through the air. And for a moment, just a moment, it felt as though love itself had answered back. Somewhere beyond the stars, James and Elizabeth were together again, dancing to the melody of a love that had never truly ended. As the years passed, Lily, now a young woman, grew up with the stories of her great-grandparents' love woven into the fabric of her life. She often found herself sitting on the porch where James had once rocked in his chair, the sound of the creaking wood now a familiar comfort. The garden they had tended together was still vibrant, alive with the colors of the flowers they had planted in the early years of their marriage. Lily never stopped wondering about the kind of love that had bound her great-grandparents together so deeply. The kind of love that didn't break even when it was tested by time, distance, and the weight of secrets. She had inherited Elizabeth's blue eyes and her great-grandfather's warmth, but it was the strength of their love she carried within her most of all. One day as she sat in the garden, lost in thought, she felt a presence beside her. It was an odd, comforting sensation, as if someone were sitting just beyond the edge of her vision. She smiled softly, knowing exactly who it was. "Grandpa James?" she whispered. "Grandma Lizzie?" The breeze stirred the branches of the old oak tree nearby, its leaves swaying as though in response. And for a moment, just a fleeting moment, she could almost hear the soft hum of Elizabeth's favorite song playing in the background. Something James had always said reminded him of her. Lily's heart swelled with warmth, as if her great-grandparents were still there, watching over her, guiding her through the ups and downs of life, just as they had done for each other. Years went by, and Lily found herself in her own relationship, experiencing the kind of love that had once been so foreign to her, wild, untamed, and full of possibility. It wasn't perfect, but she never stopped believing in the power of love to endure, just as her great-grandparents had shown her. On the day of her wedding, surrounded by family and friends, she held in her hand a small, folded piece of paper, the letter James had written to Elizabeth before his passing. She carried it with her, tucked away in her bouquet, as a symbol of the legacy of love she had inherited. As she stood before her partner, looking into their eyes, Lily thought of her great-grandparents, of the love they had shared, and the lessons they had passed down through the generations. She thought of how they had made it through the toughest of times, never letting go of the bond they shared, no matter the obstacles. And as she exchanged vows, she whispered a promise, one that echoed through the generations: "I will love you with the same strength, the same devotion as they loved each other." The wind picked up once more, rustling through the trees in the garden, as though James and Elizabeth were there, watching over her, proud of the woman she had become. For love, like the roots of a deep and ancient tree, would always grow. As the years flowed by, Lily found herself reflecting more and more on the legacy her great-grandparents had left her. Their love, the way it had persevered through the trials and separations, had shaped her own understanding of commitment. She had married her partner Julian with a heart full of hope, but it was the story of James and Elizabeth that had given her the strength to face the difficult moments that every relationship encounters. Life wasn't always smooth. There were times when Lily and Julian faced challenges, disagreements, misunderstandings, and moments when they doubted themselves. But during those tough times, Lily would often walk into the garden, the place where James and Elizabeth had once found solace, and sit by the old oak tree. She would close her eyes, breathe in the familiar scent of lavender that seemed to linger in the air, and think of the love that had once flourished there. She thought of how, despite the hurt, Elizabeth had always chosen James and how James had chosen her, every single day. On those days, Lily would remember the stories her great-grandfather had told her, how he had faced rejection from Elizabeth's family, how they had been told they couldn't be together. Yet, against all odds, they had made a life for themselves, full of laughter, joy, and unwavering support. She thought of the quiet courage her great-grandparents had shown and how they had given each other the space to grow, to learn, and to heal. She would tell Julian the stories, and it always brought them closer. They had been through hardships of their own, but those stories were a reminder that love wasn't just about perfection. It was about the willingness to choose each other, even when it was hard. One rainy afternoon, after an argument with Julian that had left her feeling distant, Lily wandered into the garden as the rain began to fall softly around her. She knelt in front of the small stone marker where James and Elizabeth's names were inscribed, and she placed a bouquet of lavender at the base. She whispered a silent prayer to them, asking for strength, for guidance, and for the kind of love they had shared. As the rain began to ease, she felt a sense of calm wash over her. It was as if, in that moment, James and Elizabeth's spirits had wrapped themselves around her like a warm embrace. She stood, wiped her eyes, and smiled through the lingering tears. She knew that love wasn't always easy, but it was always worth fighting for. She had learned that from the love story of a black man and an English woman who had lived through the most difficult of times but had always kept each other at the center of their world. Lily returned to the house, where Julian was sitting on the porch, waiting for her. He stood as she approached, his eyes filled with regret and love. Without a word, they embraced, and in that moment, Lily realized that the most important lesson her great-grandparents had taught her wasn't about avoiding conflict. It was about forgiveness, understanding, and the strength to rebuild after the storms. Years later, when Lily and Julian had children of their own, they shared the stories of James and Elizabeth, stories of a love that defied odds, that transcended boundaries, and that had withstood the test of time. They told their children that love wasn't about perfection but about the commitment to continue loving, even when the road wasn't easy. They passed down the journal, the letters, and the lessons, making sure the legacy of James and Elizabeth would never fade, no matter how many generations passed. And in the quiet moments of their lives, as the sun set over the garden where it all began, Lily knew that the love of her great-grandparents would forever live on in the hearts of their descendants. A love that, like the roots of the old oak tree in the garden, would continue to grow, deepening and strengthening with each passing year.